If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Okay, so this is the first section, the first video in the reading comprehension lesson, and we're going to go over the reading comprehension approach in this video. So how do we approach the reading comprehension passages? Well, the reading comprehension passages, they test your ability to efficiently absorb long passages of dense material, and the only way to do well on this section is to actually learn how to read the passages critically. So that's what we're going to cover in this video, the critical reading aspect. So, the reading basics. Okay, the first thing is you have to understand what you're actually being tested on. Now, once again, you're not reading for pleasure and you're not reading for the information, for the content. You're reading an argument. That's the key thing. You have to focus on the logic, on the reasoning behind it. Then you have to understand your approach. So you have to understand what you're doing. You have to make sure that you read actively. You have to make sure that you're reading for structure. You have to practice developing a rich visual and conceptual structure as you're reading, and so that you're not just sounding out the words in your head. You're building out a scene, you're building out a scenario in your head, and that's essentially what you're going to be doing. You're going to be building a scenario, and you're asking yourself, what is the author saying? That's very key. You're not just reading and having a wall of text in your head. You're trying to figure out what exactly is going on visually and conceptually. And you have to make sure to pay attention to the relationships between the sentences amongst themselves, and you have to consider the overall structure of the passage. So not just what is the author saying, but how does it connect to what is being said, to what was already said. As you read each piece of information, you're asking yourself, what does this mean? How does this connect to what I've read? Now, in addition to that, what you have to do is you have to not be intimidated by the subject matter. Remember, the test is designed so that you're familiar with the content in the passages. The content won't be something beyond your comprehension. So there may be something new or something that you're not completely familiar with, but they won't give you anything that is completely unfamiliar. So anything that is unfamiliar will be understandable through context. And everything that you need to answer those questions is going to be in the passage. So don't worry if it's something that you're not too familiar with. As you're reading through the passage, you'll be able to understand everything, because remember, the point isn't for them to test your knowledge. The point is for them to test your ability with respect to reading, with respect to reasoning and logical relationships. Okay, in addition to that, it's very important to focus on focus. What I mean by that is just you have to develop the ability to maintain your focus in terms of what you're reading. And this is the most important skill to have, is this ability to stay focused. If you can prevent your mind from wandering, you will be able to follow the passage. And that comes with practice, and that comes with what I had mentioned earlier, by focusing on developing, as you're reading, visualizing a scene, visualizing a conceptual structure as you're going through it, so that you're visualizing as you're reading what you're reading, and you're not just sort of sounding it out. You have a wall of text and you're thinking about something else. And that's actually going to be very key. That's something you'll be working on as you read the passages, as you do the exercises for this. In addition to that, you want to focus on your attitude. So, being anxious or unhappy about the task of reading the passage is going to make it more difficult to understand what it's about. So you want to try and approach it in terms of a positive experience. If you can make the reading experience a positive experience, you will better understand the passage. You'll better be able to focus. So you want to approach the passage with curiosity, and essentially treat it as an opportunity to learn something new. If you can engage your natural curiosity as opposed to your sort of natural dislike of having to do work, you'll be able to better understand what's going on. And you also don't want to worry about speed. Speed is not a factor, at least initially. You won't have to learn how to speed read. The most timing issues are actually due to a lack of focus and having to reread. So you're focusing really on just making sure that you're understanding things so that you don't have to reread it. As you get better at the techniques in the system that we'll go through in these videos, in these sections, your focus and your absorption of info will improve, and that's going to improve your timing. You're not actually going to have to learn to move your eyeballs faster. Okay, now in terms of what to avoid, so those are things you should focus on. So what do you not want to do? Well, like I mentioned, or rather, sorry, as I did not mention, you want to avoid skimming. You don't want to just read through it quickly. This because if you just skim through it, it's not going to give you a good enough understanding of the passage to answer the questions. The passages are complex and they require an understanding of details to be understood as a whole. And skimming means that you're leaving out large parts of that information. So you're not really going to have an accurate idea of what the important points are, and you won't be able to follow the complex argument. They do that by design. So that if you skim, you're going to have to go back and reread carefully anyway, so you're going to be wasting your time. Then the nature of these passages is such that, and the questions, that if you just go through it and have a general idea, you really won't be able to answer the questions. And that's what I was saying, that they do that by design. They don't make it so you can just kind of skim through it and then go back and look for the answer. You have to have an understanding of what the passage is talking about in order to effectively do that. So you don't want to skim. Likewise, you don't want to read just first or just the first and last sentence of each paragraph. Sometimes I've heard students have had this technique sort of advocated that they should just read the first sentence or just read the first and last sentence of the paragraph, try to understand. That'll give you an idea or what's going on. There's the same thing as skimming. It's not going to give you a good enough understanding of the passage. The point of reading just the first and last sentence is to identify the main point of the paragraph, but that's generally not enough. The structures of the paragraph vary, and the main point is not necessarily in the first or last sentence. So if you're just hoping to find the main point, you are not necessarily even going to succeed at that, because they may put the main point in the middle. And also, it's another waste of time, because you're going to have to reread anyway. If you just read parts of it, you're not going to have a good enough understanding to adequately do the questions. You also definitely want to not read the questions first. Do not read the questions first. This is not going to be helpful in giving you an idea of what the passage, and it's actually going to confuse you because you'll have additional information to keep in your head. The point of reading the questions first is to get an idea of what the passage is about. And so the questions give you an idea of the key points, but without context, you're not going to be able to form a coherent picture of the overall idea. You'll just have sort of, jumbled up information. And also, the first paragraph generally sets up the passage. So you won't have to actually read the questions to get an idea. It's generally going to be in the first paragraph. And likewise, this is what I had mentioned before, keeping track of what you read in the questions can actually be distracting from adequately understanding the passage, because you're going to be dealing with that information that you just read, and as you're reading the passage, you're trying to incorporate the passage into what you had read in the questions. It can get distracting and confusing. Once again, it wastes time and it prevents an adequate understanding of what the passage is talking about when you're actually reading through it. So those are the things that you want to avoid. There's some things you want to do. There's certain things that have been suggested to people, or that are in maybe some other approaches, that I definitely recommend that you don't do. That for the basic reason that they're either confusing or they will waste time.
Okay, so with respect to the approach fundamentals, you want to think of the passage as a collection of sub-arguments that fit together to communicate a broader point. So to have a good understanding of the passage that will allow you to best answer the questions, there's two key things that you need to focus on as you're reading the passage. The narrow context, and this is what is going on in the sub-argument, and roughly speaking, this is what happens in each paragraph. Now, the paragraphs can be arguments, so a paragraph can just be one argument, or they could just be context, where they just present you a collection of statements or observations, or it could be some sort of combination of context or argument. And obviously, you can have more than one sub-argument per paragraph. You can have a couple of different arguments in a paragraph, but a good sort of simplified way of thinking about this is that the paragraphs in a passage are arguments. They're the sub-arguments that connect together. Now, you can think of this narrow context, looking at each paragraph or the sub-arguments within a paragraph individually, as the more detailed level of analysis of each passage. So this is what's going on in the sort of sub-points that are subsidiary points that are being made, and how are they being made in order to get to the overall point. So that's the narrow context. You also have the overall context, or the broad context, and this is how do all of these sub-arguments fit together. So roughly speaking, this is how are the paragraphs connected? How do they connect together? Now, you want to be careful because you can have large and complex paragraphs with multiple sub-arguments. So once again, it's not essentially just paragraphs are arguments that connect together. There could be complexity within a paragraph. So the question is, once again, so how do these connect together? So how do the sub-arguments function collectively? How does the passage move from start to end? How do we get from the beginning, from the intro paragraph, from the first paragraph to the last paragraph? What is it that the author does? Now, I say move because that I think is a good way of describing what is going on in a passage in a sort of fundamental sense in terms of the overall structure or the overall connection between these subarguments. So, in terms of this movement, and you'll see in a second what I mean, you can think of it in several different ways. So, how do they function collectively? Well, first, the argument or the passage could be moving forward. Now, what I mean by that is that the subarguments connect in order to provide additional support for main or supporting points. So this is the argument or the author writing the passage in such a way that as you're reading, you are provided support or you are provided the next step in an argument that builds on that support. So that's movement forward, and that's sort of the conventional way in which we write uh, any sort of essay that you've written, or any standard essay, any sort of standard article that you may have read in a magazine. It just moves forward. It provides a thesis, and then it gives you points that build together to provide support for that. And that's essentially what I mean by forward, straightforward and conventional argument in an essay, or reasoning in an essay. There's also backwards, and that is where the subarguments connect in order to challenge the main or supporting points. So essentially, you can think of this as criticism or as a challenge. Now, it won't necessarily be the author challenging something. It could be the author introducing another perspective or another position that challenges them, or introducing a couple of different positions or perspectives, one where one or both challenge each other. But the point is, this is a situation where, as you're reading, you're encountering some sort of resistance or some sort of challenge where whereas the author is presenting the information, that information is pushing against something, it's challenging or criticizing something. Now, this is something that we do in a slightly more sophisticated way, or what you've been taught to do in a slightly more, when you're writing slightly more sophisticated essays, where you introduce a potential challenge to your argument and then you deal with the argument. It's not the sort of conventional essay, where the conventional essay is just, as I mentioned before, moving forward. Backwards is an example of criticism or challenge, and it's something that you may be familiar with, but it's a little bit less common, a bit more sophisticated. But it's fairly straightforward in the sense that it's some sort of reaction, critical reaction to a point that has been made or to the overall point. Now, in addition to that, and this is what makes these reading comprehension passages um, different from what you've seen up to this point, and what you've may have encountered in reading just Newsweek or The Economist or other magazines or something like that, is that in addition to having support for an argument, have challenging an argument or a point, the passage can also move sideways, and that is a situation where your sub argument raises additional issues for consideration, but it's not challenging or supporting something that was introduced prior, or the overall point, or something like that. It's basically a situation where the author uses what was brought up to shift the discussion in a uh, related sense, but it's an additional discussion. It's another issue that is dealt with, and that is in turn supported or challenged, etc., potentially. So that's how I want you to think about it. It's the argument or the passage can go forward, essentially building support for a point, backwards, essentially challenging support for something, or essentially challenging something, and sideways, exploring the issue by raising some sort of additional consideration that is neither support nor challenge. And then we'll go through examples of this in the exercises in other videos. Okay. So this sort of overall context is the more big picture level of analysis. This is the structure of the passage. This is how does the passage move from beginning to end in terms of how are all the sub elements connected, or the sub arguments connected together. Okay, so for a quick summary, remember, you're reading for arguments, so you're reading for the verbal reasoning and the logical connections and not for the pleasure or information that's in the passage. You don't want to focus on the content. Instead, you want to focus on staying focused and not being distracted or worrying about speed. Don't skim, don't read partially, and don't start with the questions. And the passage is one long argument, and you need to pay attention to both the narrow and the broader overall context.